Look at me, for instance. But now I see your struggle. I didn't know that it meant this much for you.
It's funny how
you have a picture of me painted inside your head, yet it's colored in black and white. Maybe we can learn from each other. We have struggles, but different stories. Even though we stood before closed doors, there's no such thing as a life that's better than yours.
And thanks you too for this wonderful performance. I feel humbled and a little bit insecure to be speaking after you two. I also am sure that I don't have anything to add to the wisdom that you shared with us, but here I am. I'm going to give a very boring conference proof lecture. I'm going to read from the paper, but hopefully you can take something from it. So this weekend I was watching the documentary series America to Me. The documentary gives an intimate insight in the day-to-day struggles to equally support the personal and academic growth of all youth at a high school with a diverse student population in the US. I saw young students of color struggling to find their place in the school, telling the filmmakers that school is not really their thing, and they're not aiming for a degree of a prestigious college like Duke or Yale anyways. I saw the vice principal assert matter-of-factly that the school is failing its students every day because there is a notable and slowly growing achievement gap between students along racial lines. The vice principal, Dr. Shayla Holland, is a woman of color. In the second episode, she is filmed while packing her things and leaving for a new job because she feels the board of the school is not supporting the necessary changes to enhance the emancipation of underprivileged students in the school. She says, "Every space has a culture. This school is grounded on white cultural norms. If I don't show up thinking, talking, being, feeling white, specifically as a white male in this building, there are repercussions connected to that. Some of the things that I experienced as an administrator in this building, I feel more affinity to a black girl in a classroom than other administrators." Shayla tears up. The filmmaker asks her whether she wishes to stop the interview. She decisively shakes her head. "This is me," she says. She takes her breath and continues speaking. "I guess I will say to the next person that has this job, our kids, our faculty and staff, anyone that walks in this building deserves to come into a space where they can bring all of who they are authentically. There is a difference in surviving and living. What if all our kids can live here? What if all our faculty and staff can live and not survive?" In this fragment, Shayla touches upon a fundamental issue that I absolutely recognize, despite the fact that the societal conditions are in many ways very different in the US and the Netherlands. Here in the Netherlands, just like in the US, we are dealing with an achievement gap along racial and ethnic lines. This achievement gap is related to the degree in which students feel that they can genuinely belong to the educational institutions in which they are schooled. On top of this, the future perspectives of students from underprivileged families is becoming more and more uncertain. Just yesterday, the Dutch National Socio-Economic Board published a report in which they stated that the stress level amongst teens and young adults is extremely worrying. Stress and precarity are intimately related here. For first-generation students from a lower-class background, it becomes more and more difficult to climb the socio-economic ladder. Student loans are very expensive, and the flexibilization of the labor market makes it highly unlikely that young people will find a fixed job to pay for their debts. On top of that, buying a house in one of the large cities has become nearly impossible. New generations are pushed to believe that only excellent achievers are lucky enough to experience social security. The pressure to compete each other and perform at an unrealistically high level leads to stress and burnouts, but also to existential uncertainty and a loss of self-worth for a growing number of young people. In this context, we still have the hope that educational institutions will serve as emancipation machines. In reality, unequal access to education and the failure of educational institutions to equally support the sense of belonging and growth of students with different backgrounds threatens not only the future perspective, but also the general well-being of underprivileged students. In this sense, I find the difference which Sheila makes between a space in which one is living and a space in which one is merely surviving a telling difference. A survival mode does not leave room for personal development and the flourishing of individuals and communities. I wish to share some thoughts I have with you about this difference between living and surviving. What does it mean to have schools in which some students can live while others are just surviving? How can we come out of the survival modus and create educational spaces in which all students get the opportunity to live to their fullest potential? Let me first tell you something about the place from which I reflect on these questions. I work in higher education, in the Faculty of Social Studies and Pedagogy of In Holland, a University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam. We educate the future youth professionals and social workers that will do street-level youth work in the neighborhood, teach parenting courses in local community centers, supervise youth groups in group homes, detention centers and mental health institutions, become remedial teachers at primary schools and job coaches at the Youth Service Center of the municipality. Our school is characterized by a very diverse student population, comprising of a large number of first-generation students and students of migrant descent. Some were born and raised in the super diverse neighborhoods of Amsterdam. Others come from small, fairly homogeneous villages in rural areas. They finished the lowest level of Dutch secondary school, went on to do vocational training, did several internships or worked besides going to school, and finally became students of higher education. They traveled a long road before they started their degree at our school. Additionally, a considerable number of students choosing the BA program of social work have personal experiences with youth services and/or mental health institutions. They struggle to acquire the study skills, communication skills, and social skills that are expected of them in the classroom. Despite the fact that In Holland aspires to be a place where all students can develop their talents and where diversity can be celebrated as a strength, the achievement gap between students with and without a migrant background and students with and without parents who have a degree of higher education has not been sufficiently bridged yet. In the first year, all of our students take classes about socialization processes. The different ways in which students experience these classes is often very telling. Many of the white students from middle-class families who are confident about their own professional futures like to talk about themselves. They enjoy the comparison of experiences and often say things like, "I really enjoy seeing that we are all different and yet have so much in common." Other students, who may be students of color, students with a lot of care responsibilities at home, students dealing with mental health issues, or students who are struggling to make ends meet financially, often do not feel safe and supported enough to share their personal stories in the classroom. They are reminded that their experiences deviate from dominant social or cultural standards, and often either come to the conclusion that they should quietly try to fit in, or they opt out of the student community and just work for their exams. In a school that is designed to train youth professionals who are sensitive to the unique stories and specific circumstances of youth in vulnerable situations, we reproduce mechanisms of exclusion and marginalization that silences certain voices. In fact, what I see happening in our classrooms is the reproduction of processes of othering. the conscious or subconscious stressing of a distinction between people who are considered full and respected members of a certain group or community and those who are considered to be strange, deviant, threatening, or undesired outsiders. Othering can lead to prejudices and social stigma based on group identities, whereby a certain dominant us gains a privileged position over them. Those with non-dominant identities become marginalized and experience a lack of equal opportunities and recognition. Processes of othering not only lead to social stigma, but also have a certain dehumanizing effect. In its most extreme form, those who are seen as the others with capital O, the absolute others, are seen as beings we cannot identify or empathize with, beings we no longer recognize as fellow human beings. The tendency to dehumanize others becomes apparent in many everyday social interactions. When black people are compared to monkeys in bad jokes, for example. When teenagers who are loitering on the streets say they feel hunted down like animals by the police. Or when young patients say they feel treated like test animals by doctors and therapists. This dehumanizing effect of processes of othering have a profound impact on the well-being of those who are objectified by it, and therefore on their capacity to live their lives to the fullest. This is why I find the distinction between living and surviving very fruitful to address the dangers of processes of othering. One could say that in its most extreme form, the dehumanizing effect of othering can threaten the living condition of people. It can lead to the social death of certain groups. Historian and cultural sociologist Orlando Patterson described how slavery causes the social death of those who are enslaved. People experience social death when they do not count as members of a society, when they are severely humiliated, looked down upon and exploited as usable objects, but not recognized as human subjects. They may be physically alive, but are detached from meaningful relations with others. People who are socially dead live their lives, but their lives do not matter to the rest of society. According to Patterson, this is a permanent condition of deprivation and oppression, which produces not only civil exclusion, but also cultural alienation. On an ontological level, the slave becomes the constitutive outside of what is a human being, a living creature whose existence can only be defined in negative terms, non-citizen, non-person, etc. One could argue whether social death as the ultimate consequence of othering ever took place in this pure form, since even those who were or are enslaved are never fully deprived of all humanity, all means of cultural expressions and all meaningful relationships with others. Then nevertheless, it is important to recognize that processes of othering can touch people in the core of their being and have a profound impact on the potential to live a humane life. It is therefore not strange to note that the level of social stigma that people have to deal with corresponds with the extent to which they can truly feel alive. So let me return to my first question. What does it mean to have schools in which some students can live while others are just surviving? It means that we do not sufficiently protect underprivileged young people from the impact of othering. Those who are othered in certain spaces are condemned to a survival mode, in which they cannot fully express their identity and their needs, dreams and ambitions are only met on a basic level. They are not recognized as rich, multidimensional persons who deserve to be supported in living rich, multidimensional lives. Shayla was not the first person to teach me about the difference between living and surviving. In 2015, I conducted research with formerly incarcerated people in the US, and I interviewed Chris, who was 26 years old at the time and had just spent 3 years in prison. Interestingly enough, Chris told me that education had helped him regain his sense of humanity, self-worth and purpose after he came out of prison. He had dropped out of school at a young age and spent his teenage years being involved in gang activities. In prison, he started reading a lot and decided to finish high school. When I met Chris, he was an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, enrolled in a public policy program. Chris told me about this silent older guy that he had met in prison, who borrowed him books and who gave him some real knowledge, as Chris expressed it. I quote Chris: "Like we were talking about living versus surviving. He was like, man, all we have been doing our whole life is surviving, and we get that confused with what is living, so we become naturalized to surviving and forget that we are not even living. And surviving is totally different from living, because when you're surviving, you're doing whatever you can to basically make it through the day. You are not nurturing your mind, body and soul. You are not treating yourself. You don't even know what happy really is. So he was like, when you start living, that's when you will see a difference. I still remember that to this day. Surviving versus living. And it's very different. Right now I feel like I'm doing a little bit of both, because I'm a student and I'm trying to get through the day. But at the same time I have been experiencing these different things since I've been out. I do feel like I had a chance to live now. And just that conversation kind of opened my mind a bit, because I had never really considered my personal life and the people around me that way. I always thought we was living, but yeah, I was just surviving." Here Chris is explaining how the social stigma of growing up in a poor and violent neighborhood of East Oakland and the stigma of being incarcerated slowly and almost unnoticeably made him lose the sense of value of his life. His pursuit of critical awareness through education actually helped him regain his sense of being alive. For him, going back to school after his release was about reclaiming a life that goes beyond the basic functions of the body. It relieved him from the feeling that his life was constantly and immediately being threatened by violence, and that he had to put up a tough persona in order to survive that threat. Entering the higher education system wasn't easy for Chris. He often felt out of place, alone, insecure and stressed in community college, and especially in his first year at uni. It was only after he joined the Underground Scholars, a support group for students who had, like him, been through the prison system, that he fully started to live his life as a student. He told me that he finally believed he could finish his degree and that he allowed himself to relax from time to time. He took his mom on a wine tasting trip in Sonoma Valley during the summer break, and he told me it was in such shared moments of carefree happiness that he had regained his dignity as a person. Chris is now enrolled in a PhD program and well on his way to make his mark on public policy reforms in Northern California. However, he also lost his younger sister to gun violence earlier this year. Right now, Chris is both living and surviving at the same time. So, on to my second question. How can we help students who come out of the survival mode and create educational spaces in which all students get the opportunity to live life to their fullest potential? Civil rights professor John A. Powell has emphasized that the opposite of othering is not saming, but belonging. I quote Powell: "Belonging does not insist that we are all the same. It means we recognize and celebrate our differences in a society where we, the people, includes all the people." When I bring Powell's insight to an educational setting, I find it important to explore how we can turn the school into a space of belonging, where differences between students are not effaced, but recognized and addressed with the aim of making everyone equally feel at home and equally supported in their personal and professional development. Chris's story indicates how education can, when it provides the right support to those with limited access to financial, social and academic capital and other resources, have a truly liberating and emancipatory impact. Education and educational spaces can actually provide a very powerful antidote against the process of othering and its dehumanizing effects, if They can indeed foster a sense of belonging. Chris's story also indicates how precarious it is to establish the sense of belonging if the social stigma students have to deal with is tenacious. This does not only account for students who come from an underprivileged socioeconomic position or for students who are dealing with institutional racism, but also for students who are dealing with the social stigma related to mental health issues. This is why we decided to invest in small learning communities aimed at fostering the sense of belonging of students in my University of Applied Sciences. The work in the learning communities is based on peer-to-peer mentoring. This year we divided the first year classes of the BA Social Work up in small groups of 6 students. Each group is assigned a student coach. Under supervision of older graduate students, the first year students engage in the sharing of life histories and claim their role as a student. We noticed that both inside and outside of the school, certain stories are more easily heard and understood than other stories. I find it important that future youth professionals are trained to listen to non-dominant narratives about the various ways in which young people try to find their place in the world. I believe that in order to become good listeners, all of our students should first of all feel empowered to claim their own story. For students with non-dominant identities and students who have personally felt how processes of othering can make one feel unwelcome in a classroom, it can be particularly challenging to find their own voice and claim their story. We hope that the work in these small intensive learning communities can enhance students' sense of belonging in their study program and enhance their study success. They meet in a safe space and engage in storytelling methodologies and other activities to enforce their resilience and capabilities. The student coaches also work with the first year students on drawing their roadmaps to resources. In the group, the students discuss how they can identify and visualize specific goals. Consequently, they discuss which ways to pursue these goals, the potential risks they might encounter on their pursuit, the potential resources in their environment to support them in dealing successfully with these risks, and the personal qualities they have and can utilize in order to mobilize the resources they need. They also discuss how they can support each other. All students have the potential to function as resources for their peers, not only when challenges and difficulties arise, but precisely in co-creating roadmaps to meaningful and successful development. The approach of the learning communities enables students to co-research each other's stories and pathways. Fatima, one of the students who involved in the co-creation of the program for the learning community, said, "We all need our own Google Maps in order to navigate our study program and orient ourselves in this new life as a student of higher education. Together, we can help each other to design a tailor-made, personalized navigation tool." We believe that this approach of storytelling and road mapping is particularly important for students who have been affected by mental health issues and consequent social stigma, and for students who have been affected by social stigmas and consequent mental health issues. Last spring, I learned another lesson about the difference between living and surviving from one of our students, Marilisa. At the time, Marilisa was third-year student of our BA program in pedagogy. She took part in a pilot project for the learning communities, specifically focused on claiming your story. Marilisa had been extremely quiet during the workshops. A few times I went up to her to ask her whether she felt okay in the group, because I was afraid that she felt the project had no added value for her. She assured me that she was okay and that she wished to continue as a participant. "I feel insecure sometimes though," she said. "All of the other students have so many stories to tell. They have so much life experience. I don't really know what my story is. I feel like my contribution is small and insignificant, so I prefer to be silent and to listen to the others," she said hesitantly. So Marilisa continued to attend the workshops in her own quiet and attentive way. until the last workshop. We discussed who felt confident enough to go on stage and read their story in front of an audience during the final presentation of the project. Marilisa was the first student to raise her hand. I wrote my story down and I would really like to present it, she said. So, a few weeks later, Marilisa stood in front of an audience of about 150 people. She talked about a strange feeling she had had for many years. It was as if her life was fleeting by in a sort of waiting room modus. Time passed. She made it through the day. She met people and had experiences, but she did not really have the feeling that things were actually happening, that she was actually there, that she was actually living. It was like she was eternally waiting for that moment in which her life would really begin. In short, she was surviving, but not really living. Gradually, over the past years, when Marilisa started studying, things changed for her. She learned to admit to herself that she had an eating disorder. She went into therapy and she started to open up to people in her environment. For quite some time, Marilisa struggled with the question how she could become a good youth professional and help kids and teens with their problems if she wasn't really sure how she could help herself. Recently, she found part of the answer to her own question. She discovered that she could already have an impact on young people by inviting them to openly speak their minds in her presence, even if she didn't have an answer to all of their questions. This seems obvious, but unfortunately it does not happen enough. Being present in a moment, having an attentive attitude and showing genuine interest in their experiences is already a great start when you are working with youth. The story Marilisa wished to claim was the story about the moment in which she left the waiting room and started living her life. This wasn't the moment in which she solved all of her problems and insecurities, but it was the moment in which she felt the capacity and courage to be fully present in the world, to make herself seen and heard, and feel all of the dimensions of her experiences right here and now in all their complexity. Life starts now, even if it feels scary and difficult. It does not lie somewhere ahead of you in the future, Marilisa concluded. I think her message is meaningful for anyone working with young people who feel othered, whether we are youth counselors, social workers, or educators. Like Shayla from the high school, which is portrayed in America to Me, I hope that together we can create spaces where students like Chris, Marilisa, and so many others can truly live instead of merely surviving. Thanks.